Welcome to the FNDN Series, your deep dive into startup compensation with industry leaders from across the startup world. Join me, Matt McFarlane, a people operations leader turned compensation specialist, as we uncover the strategies and practices driving success in tech startups around the world. Hear insights from heads of people, founders, and experts as we explore how to build robust compensation frameworks that not only fuel growth and retention, but do so in the dynamic startup environment that we all know and love. Let's get into it. In today's episode, we're exploring how in fast growth startups, your comp practices will break. It's not if, but when. We explore the early warning signs and how to rebuild compensation structures that grow with you, not against you. Before we dive straight into the topics, I'd love you to spend a brief moment, and for those who aren't familiar with you, a little bit about who you are and what you do.
I love that. The not being familiar with me, it's like they'd be perfectly forgiven for not being familiar with me. So my name is Naomi Trickey. I'm the Chief People Officer at a company called Mews. We provide hospitality software for hotels in order to free up the people who work in those hotels to provide remarkable experiences for their guests. I'm also a NED for an embedded finance company called Griffin. So I chair the People and Governance Committee. So that is me. I've worked in technology for a scarily long time in a variety of roles, but started becoming I became a Chief People Officer about 10 years ago. So I've been doing this work since then.
All right, Naomi, in today's section, we're going to talk about when does compensation break? So, Mews and other organizations that you're a part of or have been a part of, they go through various stages. I know I have seen my fair share of, not just comp, but many things breaking and having to be, fixed and rebuilt along the way. Maybe let's start with a little bit of context first before we sort of dive into the various different stages of Mews. But tell me, when you joined the organization, how big was it then and how big is it now?
When I joined, it was about sort of between 500 and 600 people. So it's about 2.5 years ago. Because they'd done the classic COVID thing of growing and then retrenching and then growing again. And then we hired 500 people in my first year, about 500 people in my second year. And then we've seen average attrition. So we're about 1,300 now. And then valuation, we achieved unicorn status. So north of $1 billion in valuation. So that's where we're at. And then we operate in, we've got about 40 different nationalities.
Amazing. And like as in people employed in different countries as well, or just that's your demographic makeup?
The demographic, but then we are remote first. So we do have people, I don't even know in how many countries our people are operating.
Too many to count.
Because they tend to move around. But we have about 18 different entities starting point.
Yeah, wow. Okay, that's amazing. And if you were to think of you gave some incredible, circumstances in which you would understand something like comp, but I'm sure many other parts of the people function tend to heave and hoe and potentially even break. What kind of surface in your mind are some of the key stages there? And maybe not even just with Mews, but with other organizations where you go, this for me is a clear sort of tipping point at which we need to consider something like comp.
Yeah. I mean, I like everybody else, I read LinkedIn, for ideas and I read my peers' thoughts on the work. And I'm always sort of slightly envious of people who say, I'm at a company with 150 people and we've started to put in place comp structures. And I'm like, oh my God, you're so smart. Because it's, I would love for it to be at that stage in some ways and for that forethought to have been applied. But hindsight is 2020, blah, blah, blah. And the reality is that often these organizations, the kind of organizations I work for, so fast growth SaaS companies essentially, they grow organically. And actually that's part of the joy. There's a kind of level of experimentation and seeing what works and so on. What is most interesting to me, and the stage I'm really fascinated by at this point in my career is that sort of pivot point when you're moving from that kind of hacky sort of let's just do it stage to, okay, now let's look at the friction point between growth and structures and let's figure out what are the new structures we need and what are what old structures are no longer fit for purpose. And so, for example, when I joined Mews, we didn't have an org-wide process for performance or pay. So a couple of the teams had very granular processes because of the leaders within those organizations had put them in place, and they were perfect for that stage. And they were sort of almost works of art. These processes, they were really thoughtful and really helpful. But I am accountable for the entire organization, and there needs to be a process across that works across the organization. And there needs, because not only because you need to report on it, but also you need to have comparability in order to understand what's working in one place and what's not working in another. And it's not acceptable for me to say I don't have the data on that, because they don't follow the same process. It's just not acceptable. The other critical point is a lot of these organizations depend heavily on internal mobility. You can't have internal mobility. Internal mobility is compromised if different parts of the organization are operating in different ways. And so you need that consistency. Another thing that often happens is pay and performance conversations happen at the same time. Now, obviously, we don't work for free. There is a relationship between performance and pay, but we all know what happens if you go into a conversation where you're expecting to hear about your pay. That is all you hear, and you miss that rich feedback that you should be expecting from your performance review. So separating out those conversations. Another classic, everything is done on a spreadsheet, and the endless points of failure that creates. And we're not over that, by the way. Just for full transparency, I don't want people to walk away thinking that I'm saying that Mews is perfect, because we are definitely not. We are going through this with everyone else, but trying to reduce the points of failure, introduce guardrails, and reduce the points of failure in the process. Another thing that happens, I've got a long list. We had salary bands that were very granular. And in other areas, we had no salary bands at all. And the interesting, knotty problem there is, on one hand, employees often really like that because they can see clear progression, because they get like a 3% increase and it feels like they're going somewhere. But actually, it drives the wrong conversations. It drives very short-term behavior around pay and performance. And my interest and my desire is to drive a much less transactional thinking around pay and performance. And for that, you have to be looking longer term. And so the salary bands and the job gradings have needed to be adjusted. And that work is underway. It is really, as you know, I have a new director of Total Reward, and one of her Q2 projects actually is around job grades, because they've also grown organically. So what you again, inconsistent, incomparable, and it ultimately the employee is left kind of going, well, the only way I can progress is by getting a pay rise, and it's just not true.
Yeah, I guess that's a great sign of a sort of a breaking point as well, is that if people are feeling that they have to do that, or if you are seeing that that attrition is driven by that, is that maybe your promotion processes are a little bit too arduous, or your comp increase processes. I mean, there's certainly been stories that I've heard of where people have left the organization, come back at a higher level, and that was an easier door to go through than internally. In terms of being able to progress.
Yeah.
So yeah, there's a lot of different things there that are interesting little stress tests, aren't there?
Yeah, and I haven't seen that at Mews actually. Our attrition is really low, but I have seen it in other organisations. And once that door is open and people are walking out of it, it's really, really, really hard to close it again, because it's an erosion of trust. And essentially, one of the main purposes of these structures and frameworks is to establish trust, because they give clarity, and nothing drives trust more than clarity, because people just understand where they stand, and then they can make a decision like the adults that they are about that. And we all know that when you go to another organization, that's when you get the big pay jumps, and organizations like mine, working at Mews, one of the wonderful things, many wonderful things about it, but one of the wonderful things about it is that our growth rate means that we can often match the ambition of the people that work here. I've worked in places where they're growing much more slowly, and so the ambition, but ambitious people work in this context, right? That is a common thread of all the people I work with. And if your organization isn't growing fast enough, then it outstrips the rate of growth of the organization, and so you're forced to leave in order to progress. And that can be to do with pay, but it can also be to do with new roles and skills development and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
At Mews, our growth rate is pretty pacey, and so actually we've been able to contain that to a certain extent. But you can't rest on your laurels. You have to keep pushing and driving in this area, because it really matters. Development matters to people.
Yeah, I completely agree. It tends to be a very small company challenge, right? Is how do you keep people for a longer in their career when their ambition does outpace the growth of the organization? So it's nice to be in a place where you're kind of able to handle that with with relative scope. Yeah,
It's a joy, and there's always new things going on, and we're building out fintech practice, and there's always something going on at Mews like that. That becomes a different problem.
Yeah. Also, what are some of the other sort of, canary in the coal mine type things that you look for to give you an indication that comp maybe isn't working for the stage of the organization? I think you've given a great level set around, as a CPO, and I'm looking at this from a strategic, internal mobility, etc. These are the things I'm looking for. But when these things are in place, what do you kind of look at and go, yeah, everything's kind of cool, it's humming along, or actually we're starting to see, signs or signals that we need to reevaluate these areas?
We constantly measure the engagement of our people. And actually, because we have such a transparent culture, I don't need to look too hard for the signs that something is broken. I tend to hear about it. And I either hear about it through our engagement surveys, or I hear about it directly from managers, or I hear about it directly from individuals. I'm pretty open, and people contact me all the time about all sorts of things. And so we have a company, All Hands, which is probably one of our most critical cultural assets. I don't know if I've talked to you about it before, but it's called the Boosh. So it's short for
Definitely not.
Okay, it's short for a Mews Boosh, because we do like a pun, and it's it's run by different teams at different weeks. It's very high. We set very high standard in terms of the presentation, so you don't just rock up at the Boosh, you prepare, and then and it's different themes every week and so on, different departments or whatever. But at the end we have something called Hammer Time, which is as gladiatorial as it sounds. When new people start, they're like, seriously, this happens every week.
Please tell me there's parachute pants involved as well, right?
I wish sometimes there were parachute pants. But essentially anyone can ask a question of anyone. And so often questions are submitted in advance. Sometimes questions are asked live, and then we also run a Slido. And at the same time, we have a Slack channel, which is All Boost Chat. And so whilst the meeting's going on, All Boost Chat's running along. And so when you're running a Boost, it's a level of intensity in terms of managing a meeting, because you're all, it's like being a DJ, right? Like you are literally all over the place. But those questions in Hammer Time can get really spiky. And we have a sort of level of respect that we expect from people, because obviously we want that trust and openness to be in place such that people feel able to ask the questions, but everyone has to respect that someone also has to answer that question. And when it's answering that question about pay in front of 500 people or however many are attending that week, that's pretty intense. And so I use those sorts, and we have other meetings like it. So we have a version of the Boosh with managers once a month. And I use those sorts of meetings as canaries to understand. Although they're not really canaries, they're more like really big ostriches that are like stampeding.
Happening in front of the entire company. Yeah, it's not a canary at that stage.
There's nothing canary-like about them. So yeah, it's good you hear about it. Basically, I don't know if that
Yeah.
answers your
No,
question. It's not very
well,
subtle.
it does, because I think so often, like, my typical sort of go-to response is that it's like it's in the reporting, but it's, often that's after the fact, and it's like it's
Yeah, it's
before you can kind
lagging.
of do something.
Yeah,
And so,
yeah,
yeah, I mean, the fact that you can create an environment where people do feel comfortable to raise that, and I'm assuming you're also one where it's like, it's safe to say we either don't have an answer or it's something we hadn't considered or
Oh,
something like
sure.
that, where,
Yeah.
and I think that's another thing that I really try to help people recognize more often, is that even though comp feels like one of those things that you just have to have nailed because it's so deeply important and personal and all those sorts of things, we are still all humans at the end of the day, and we're all just trying to do the best that we can. And, if you take this approach of this is how we deliver compensation and we think we've got it right, but also we're also open to feedback, it just kind of really de-risks this whole place of, having it perfect and having to feel like you have to be really defensive of it as well. I think it's another thing that gets people
Does.
offside, especially when someone comes to them and says, oh, hey, I've just seen this job ad for that. And they feel like they have to justify everything right now and kind of kill it now, this question of whether or not I can get a pay increase. And it's like, just hear them out, understand where they're coming from, talk to them about what avenues there are to increase pay, if there are, those avenues, and kind of create a bit of dialogue around it rather than making them feel like they're being necessarily punished for bringing something that's important to you or to them.
I couldn't agree more. I remember when I started, my team felt a bit beleaguered, I think, because they were getting really, really hammered in hammer time, ironically. And I very quickly realized that the way around this problem is through it. And you don't get through that tension by pretending it doesn't exist. And so there's been quite a bit of coaching about showing up at meetings, and the way in which you show up. And if you show up, I don't mean to sound trite or patronizing, but if you show up with a positive mental attitude, then people are generally much more open to that. Oh, she's human. She's not trying to dupe me, and she seems like she's a kind person who's trying to do a good job, and okay, I can work with that. And so you will see me on hammer time and I will always smile, for example. Like, it's a really simple thing, but I've thought a lot about how to present myself in person, because I do a lot of speaking in front of groups of people about often very sensitive topics, and things like smiling, planting your feet on the ground, taking a breath, welcoming people into the room. These are really simple things that you can do that create that environment in which people feel able to share with you, but also respect you, because I'm not trying to hurt anyone. I'm really just trying to do my best, and my team are too. And I think that it does sound trite, the positive mental attitude, but it really is it is like one of the most powerful tools you have, I think. It's not toxic positivity either. It's not like, don't look over here, guys, everything's fine.
No, but I think it's like, like
not,
assuming positive intent, for example, is a really simple way of just going, actually, I'm
100%.
sure you have the best intention. It maybe didn't come out that way, but it's, there is a good intention here. Let's understand it and let's uncover it and kind of, go from there.
Yes, exactly. Yes.
I love it. All right. My last question around this topic, you've kind of touched on this a little bit already. So you kind of said when you got into Mews, you're about 500 people, I think you said, and maybe it wasn't as much structure as you would have liked. And so all of that needed to come in. How do you typically, and I guess with hindsight being 2020 always, how do you typically think about the different sizes and stages of companies and what they maybe need to have in place from either a comp team or a tooling? How do you sort of see that typically evolving over the scale of a company?
Yeah. Phew. I don't think there's a typical, and I think you have to. Sort of exist within the company to learn its ways, and it comes over time. And ideally, you have a really strong relationship with the CEO and the founder, or maybe the same people, whatever, and the rest of the leadership team, because the messaging does start from the top when it comes to this kind of thing. At Mews, it's very much a work in progress. Like I said earlier, I don't want to give the impression that we have it all resolved and locked down. I think that'd be really disingenuous. I think it's important that you put the team structure in place to support, because this is a lot of work. So I hired a director of total rewards. She has a customer success background. I didn't realize that was a particularly smart move. I mean, I think she's great, obviously, but until I was talking in one of my CPO, we have a bunch of WhatsApp groups and we're talking, and it turns out a couple of other chief people officers have done exactly the same thing. And I was like, oh, well, that's really interesting. But this person has worked, I know you know her, so it worked at Mercer and at Oyster. So it's a real sweet spot of being customer facing, but also understanding the employee environment and understanding benefits in its broadest sense. And so that getting that team, the leader of that team in place is a critical phase. Making sure that you have the platforms and the data. And again, this is a big one for us right now because we're moving from Bamboo to Workday, and it's an uphill struggle. So we also, to that point about the team, we've hired an analyst. So thinking about the data architecture and the data side, and there's so much data involved in pay. Creating salary bands is the next one. Because they are things that you can share, and increasingly we are being pushed by legislation on transparency. At Mews, it's like pushing at an open door because we have a very transparent culture, but it's not as straightforward as just sharing, because people need to be enabled. They need to be, managers need to be supported before their Slack lights up with 4,000 questions that they can't answer, So there's a lot around that. And then the other relationship that's really important to build is with your finance business partners, I think, because they provide deep support on org design and modeling for every function within the business. And for me, defining a pay philosophy and an approach is really, it's an ongoing dialogue that you need to have with the business, between teams at different levels across functions. So the final piece of the puzzle and the final thing that you need to have in place really is that relationship with the rest of the leadership team, so that you can determine what the pay philosophy is, especially if you're working across geographies, because there's so many different sort of expectations there.
Absolutely.
There's always tension between growth and structure, as I've said earlier, and we have constraints. Money is not an infinite resource. You talk to some of the larger tech companies and they give the impression that it's all fine, but basically when you dig deeper, it's because they don't have financial constraints, and the rest of us have. So shifting from flexibility to structure has really been a process for us, and it's a dynamic one, and it's going to keep going.
Yeah, beautiful. Laid out an incredible roadmap there for anyone considering their own compensation needs, no matter their size. I appreciate it. Thank you so much for sharing.
No worries.
And that's a wrap. We explored how to spot the early signs that your compensation model is no longer fit for scale, and how to rebuild it with clarity and intent. Stay tuned for more strategies to build resilient, future-proofed compensation foundations. Thanks for joining us on another edition of the Foundation Series. Make sure to head over to our website to subscribe to the Foundation Series for monthly editions featuring future interviews on startup compensation. In each edition, we'll explore the different strategies, trends, and challenges faced by startups around the world. If you have a burning topic you'd like me to cover, or a standout guest that you want to hear from, drop me an email so I can dive deeper into the compensation topics that matter most to you. Join me next time as we continue to uncover the strategies and practices driving success in global tech startups around the world. Thanks for listening.